I am 78 years old, and I used to believe there would always be more time to call my brother. It's a small sentence, easy to say out loud, but it has followed me around the house these past few years like a quiet shadow. I find it when I'm rinsing coffee cups in the sink, when the afternoon news hums low in the background, when I open the drawer where I keep old address books that nobody really uses anymore. His number is still written there in blue ink, from a time when writing something down meant you expected to use it again. My brother Daniel was 2 years younger than me. Growing up, that meant I was always just ahead of him. First to get a job, first to leave home, first to marry. Our parents used to say I was the careful one and he was the easy one. I don't think they meant it the way it sounds now. They meant that I worried about bills and schedules, and Daniel seemed to carry less of that weight. He was good with people, the kind of man who could talk to a mechanic or a stranger in a grocery line and make it feel natural. I was the one who kept track of things. He was the one who remembered to laugh. We grew up in Ohio in the late 1950s, in a small house with a narrow porch and a backyard that sloped just enough for rainwater to collect near the fence. Our father worked at a plant outside town, and our mother kept the house in a steady, quiet order that I didn't appreciate until I was much older. Daniel and I shared a room until I left for community college. At night we would lie in twin beds, the window open in summer, listening to crickets and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. We talked about what we would do when we were grown. I always had plans. He always had ideas. When I left for school in 1966, it felt like the first real separation between us. I wasn't going far, just a bus ride away, but it was enough to change the rhythm of our days. Phone calls were not as easy then. Long distance cost money, and money was something we all measured carefully. So we wrote letters sometimes, short ones. Mine were usually about classes and part-time work. His were about who he'd seen in town, what our parents were up to, whether the Browns had won on Sunday. Nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. Just the ordinary passing of time. I married in 1971. A small church wedding, my mother crying softly. Daniel standing next to me in a suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders yet. After the reception, he helped load gifts into the back of my car. I remember he said, "Don't forget to come back and visit, you're not moving that far." I told him of course I would. And I did at first. We drove down some weekends, brought casseroles, stayed for coffee that stretched longer than we planned. It all felt stable, predictable, like a pattern that would simply continue. Then life started to fill in the spaces. I got a full-time job at an insurance office. My wife and I bought a small house. We had our first child in 1974. Days became scheduled around work hours, school pickups, mortgage payments. When Daniel called, it was often in the evening, and sometimes I would glance at the clock, see it was already past 9, and let it ring once or twice longer before picking up. Not because I didn't want to talk, but because I was tired, and I thought I'll call him this weekend when I have more time. Weekends, though, always seemed to have their own demands. Lawn work, grocery runs, kids' soccer games once they were older. When I did call, we talked easily, as if no time had passed. That made it feel safe to delay the next call. We were brothers. There was no urgency to it. We weren't the kind of family that said sentimental things on the phone. We just checked in, made a joke, talked about work or the weather, and hung up with a simple "talk soon." In the 1980s, Daniel took a job driving delivery routes across the state. He was on the road a lot, stopping in different towns, sleeping in small motels, eating at diners where the waitress already knew what coffee he liked. He told me once that he enjoyed the quiet hours between stops. "Gives you time to think," he said. I remember nodding but not asking what he thought about during those drives. It didn't occur to me then that those long hours might have been lonely. By then my own life was crowded in a different way. Promotions at work meant longer hours. My children were teenagers, then young adults, and each phase brought its own set of responsibilities. College visits, car repairs, tuition payments. There was always something that felt immediate, something that couldn't be postponed. Calling my brother felt important but not urgent. There's a difference between the two that you don't always notice while you're living it. When our father died in 1989, Daniel and I stood together at the funeral home. Both of us older men by then, though it didn't feel that way inside. We handled paperwork, spoke with relatives, made sure our mother was looked after. We worked well together, the same way we always had. Quietly, without needing many words. That week we talked more than we had in years. Late at night, sitting at the kitchen table, we shared memories of childhood that had somehow stayed clear despite everything that had come after. Before I left to drive back home, he hugged me in the driveway. It was a firm, quick hug, the kind men of our generation were used to. He said, "We should do this more often. Not funerals, I mean, just sitting and talking." I agreed. I meant it when I said it. But meaning something and making space for it are not always the same thing. The 1990s moved quickly. My children left home one by one. My wife and I adjusted to a quieter house, though it never felt entirely quiet with work still filling my days. Daniel continued his routes, though he started talking about retiring early. He said he might buy a small place near a lake, do some fishing, maybe get a dog. I told him it sounded nice. I said we would visit once he settled in. He laughed and said, "You always say that." He didn't sound hurt when he said it. Just amused, as if he understood something about me that I hadn't fully admitted yet, that I was always waiting for a less busy season that never quite arrived. At the time I laughed too. I thought we were both joking. If you'd asked me then about my relationship with my brother, I would have told you it was good, solid, no arguments. No long silences filled with resentment. Just two men living their own lives, connected by blood and a shared past that didn't need constant attention to remain real. That was how I justified the gaps between our calls. That was how I reassured myself each time I noticed it had been a few weeks, then a few months since we last spoke. I told myself there would always be another Sunday afternoon. Another holiday season, another stretch of road when I could pick up the phone and hear his voice again. Felt like a safe assumption. Felt like the way life naturally worked. I did not yet understand how quietly time can close in, and how easily later can turn into something you can no longer reach. By the time I reached my late 50s, the pace of my days had changed, but not in the way I once imagined. Work was still there, though I had moved into a steadier position with fewer surprises. My children were grown, starting families of their own, and our house held more quiet than noise. I used to think that once the busyness of raising a family eased, I would naturally return to the people I had slowly drifted from. I pictured long phone calls on Sunday afternoons, maybe even regular visits. It seemed reasonable, almost guaranteed. The way you assume certain things will settle into place once the big responsibilities are behind you. Daniel retired before I did. He called one evening to tell me he had finally bought that small place near a lake in northern Indiana. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the sound of a man who had reached a point he'd been thinking about for years. He described the house in simple terms. 2 bedrooms, a screened porch, trees close enough to block most of the road noise. "You'd like it," he said. "It's quiet. Real quiet." I told him it sounded perfect, and I meant that too. I even walked into the kitchen where my wife was reading and said, "Daniel finally got that place by the lake." She smiled and said we should plan a visit sometime that summer. Summer came and went the way summers often do, marked by weddings, work deadlines, and small home repairs that seemed minor until they stacked together. Each time I thought about making the drive to see him, I checked the calendar and saw another obligation already written there. I told myself it would be better to go when I could stay a few days instead of just one rushed afternoon. It felt respectful to wait until I could give the visit proper time. That was the logic I used, and it sounded sensible enough that I never questioned it very hard. We still talked on the phone, though the calls were spaced further apart than I noticed at the time. When we did speak, the conversation picked up easily, as if we had only talked the week before. He told me about the lake changing with the seasons, about the old neighbors who waved from their porches, about how he had taken to walking every morning just after sunrise. I told him about my grandchildren being born, about office politics, about the new coffee place that had opened downtown. Our lives sounded different, but the tone between us stayed familiar. That familiarity made the distance feel less serious than it really was. One fall afternoon, he mentioned he had started having some trouble with his knees. Nothing dramatic, he said. Just stiffness in the mornings and a little pain after long walks. I remember leaning back in my chair, the phone pressed to my ear and saying, "Well, you're not 20 anymore." It was meant as a light remark, the kind brothers make without thinking. He laughed, but there was a pause after, longer than usual. I could have asked more questions then, whether he had seen a doctor, whether the pain was getting worse, but I didn't. The conversation shifted to something else, and I let it go, assuming it was just one of those small complaints that come with age and pass on their own. Looking back, I can see how many moments like that passed between us. Small openings where I could have stepped in a little closer, asked one more question, stayed on the line a little longer. None of them felt critical at the time. Each one seemed like something that could wait until the next call, the next visit, the next easier season. In 2008, my wife and I downsized to a smaller house after I finally retired. Packing up decades of belongings was a slow, emotional process. We sorted through old photographs, school papers, holiday cards we had saved without reading again. In one box I found a stack of letters Daniel had sent me in the late 60s and early 70s. The paper had yellowed slightly, but his handwriting was still clear and steady. I sat on the floor reading them one by one, surprised at how detailed they were. Little observations about neighbors, jokes about our father's habits, notes about what he hoped to do someday. There was a warmth in those letters that felt almost unfamiliar to the version of our relationship that existed now, built mostly on brief phone calls and occasional visits at family gatherings. That evening I told my wife I should call him, just to say I'd been reading his old letters. She said, "You should, he'd like that." But by the time we finished unpacking for the day, it was late, and I told myself it would be better to call in the morning when I was less tired. Morning came with its own tasks, utility transfers, a trip to the hardware store, a visit from our daughter who needed help assembling a crib. The day filled up before I realized it, and by the time I remembered again, it was nearly dinner. I thought I'll call him this weekend when things slow down. Weekends, even in retirement, turned out not to be as empty as I once believed they would be. There were always errands, family visits, church events, small things that made a day feel used up by evening. None of them were wrong choices. None of them felt like neglect. They were simply the ordinary texture of life continuing. The next time Daniel and I spoke, it was close to Christmas. He sounded cheerful, told me he'd put up a small tree by the window facing the lake. He described how the lights reflected on the water at night, flickering slightly when the wind moved across the surface. I told him it sounded peaceful. He said, "It is. You should come see it one winter. It's different than summer." I answered the way I often did, with an easy promise that carried no date. "We will. One of these days." He didn't press. He never did. That was part of what made it easy to delay. There was no conflict pushing us together, no urgency forcing a change. Just two brothers, each assuming the other understood that affection didn't require constant contact. In many ways, that assumption was true. We did understand each other, but understanding is not the same as presence. As the years moved into the early 2010s, I noticed our calls becoming shorter, though I told myself it was just because there was less new to report. Our lives had settled into routines. There were fewer big milestones to discuss. He talked about the same neighbors, the same walking route, the same quiet mornings by the lake. I talked about my grandchildren's school events, about minor health checkups, about the slow adjustments of aging that we both pretended were not very important. One afternoon after we hung up, I sat in my recliner and thought I should really drive up there this spring. It's only a few hours. We could sit on that porch he always talks about. I even looked up directions on the computer, tracing the route as if planning a trip. Then I closed the browser, telling myself I would choose exact dates once the weather improved and after a couple of family commitments passed. Spring came warm and early that year. I remember because the dogwood tree in our yard bloomed ahead of schedule. I also remember thinking more than once that I ought to call Daniel and ask how the lake looked with the early warmth. And each time I delayed just a little, waiting for a moment when I could talk without watching the clock. Felt respectful not to rush the call. What I didn't see then was how those small, polite delays were quietly shaping the space between us. Nothing had broken. Nothing had ended. Yet something important was thinning, thread by thread, in ways that were too subtle to alarm me at the time. It would take one particular phone call, later than it should have been, for me to realize how much of that thread I had already allowed to slip through my. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early October. I remember the light in the kitchen that day. Soft, slanting through the window above the sink, catching the dust in the air the way it always does in autumn. I was rinsing a plate from breakfast when the phone rang. I almost let it go to voicemail, not out of intention, just habit. Most calls at that hour were automated reminders or wrong numbers. But something made me dry my hands and pick it up on the fourth ring. It wasn't Danielle. It was a woman I didn't recognize at first. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if measuring each word before letting it out. She said she lived 2 houses down from him by the lake. I knew who she was then. He had mentioned her in passing before, a widow who sometimes brought over leftover pie or asked him to look at something that needed fixing. Her voice carried a kind of gentle hesitation, the kind people use when they know they are about to say something that will change how your day unfolds. She told me Daniel had been taken to the hospital the night before. He'd fallen in his driveway while bringing in groceries. He had managed to call for help, and an ambulance came quickly, but they wanted to keep him overnight for observation. He asked me to call you, she said. He didn't want to worry you, but he thought you should know. There was no panic in her tone, and that steadiness made it easy for me to stay calm too. I thanked her, asked which hospital, wrote down the name on the back of an envelope. I told her I would call the hospital later that afternoon, once visiting hours opened, and see how he was doing. I remember thinking he's probably embarrassed more than anything. He never liked making a fuss about himself. After we hung up, I stood there for a moment with the phone still in my hand. The envelope with the hospital's name felt strangely light, as if it didn't yet carry the weight it would later hold. I told my wife what had happened. She looked concerned and said, "You should go up there." I nodded and said, "Let me call first, see what the doctors say. It might just be a precaution." Even as I said it, I believed it. Falls happen. People our age slip and recover. It didn't feel like an emergency, not in the dramatic sense. That afternoon I called the hospital and was transferred twice before reaching a nurse who could confirm he was there. She spoke in the professional, reassuring tone nurses often use. He had a mild concussion, some bruising, and they were running a few tests because his blood pressure had been unstable. "He's resting right now," she said. "You can call back tomorrow, or you're welcome to visit during regular hours." I thanked her and hung up, feeling a cautious relief settle in. Sounded manageable, temporary. Something that would pass with a few days of rest and maybe a follow-up appointment. I told myself I would drive up that weekend. It was Tuesday. I had a dentist appointment Wednesday, a lunch scheduled with an old coworker on Thursday. And Friday my daughter had asked if we could watch the kids for the evening. None of these felt optional in the moment. Each one seemed like a small promise I had already made. So I reasoned that going Saturday morning would make the most sense. I could stay the night, bring him some groceries, maybe help with anything around the house that had become difficult after the fall. Felt like a responsible plan. Measured, thoughtful. On Wednesday morning I called again. This time I reached him directly. His voice sounded thinner than usual, but still recognizably his. He made a small joke about hospital food and said the doctors were being overly cautious. "You don't need to rush up here," he told me. "They'll probably send me home in a day or two." I said, "I was thinking of coming this weekend anyway. Been meaning to see that place in the fall." There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, just present. Then he said, "That'd be nice. The leaves are starting to turn." We talked for maybe 10 minutes. Nothing heavy. He asked about my grandchildren, about the dogwood tree in our yard, about whether I was still taking my morning walks. I answered each question easily. The conversation felt normal enough that it smoothed over the small unease that had been building in me since Tuesday. When we hung up, I told myself everything was under control. He was talking, joking, making plans. That meant time was still on our side. Thursday passed the way Thursdays do. Quiet errands, a bit of yard work, the lunch with my coworker where we talked about retirement aches, and the odd feeling of watching the world speed past while our own days slowed down. I mentioned Daniel's fall in a casual way, and my friend said, "Well, good thing he's okay. You'll see him this weekend." He nodded. Yes, this weekend. It felt settled, almost certain. Friday evening, while my wife and I watched our grandchildren chase each other around the living room, I noticed my phone buzzing on the coffee table. It was an unfamiliar number with the hospital's area code. For a moment, I hesitated, thinking I would let it go and call back later when things were quieter. But some small tightening in my chest, made me pick it up right away. It was the same nurse as before, or at least her voice sounded similar. She explained that Daniel had experienced some complications overnight. His blood pressure had dropped again, and they had found an issue with his heart rhythm that they were monitoring closely. She spoke calmly, professionally, but there was a firmness beneath her words that I couldn't ignore. "It would be good if you could come soon," she said. "He's asking about you." I remember looking across the room at my grandchildren laughing, at my daughter talking with my wife in the kitchen, and feeling suddenly as if I was standing slightly outside the scene, observing it from a distance. I told the nurse I would leave first thing in the morning. It was already evening, a long drive in the dark, and I told myself it was safer to rest and go early. She said that would be fine. There was no alarm in her voice, no urgency that forced immediate action. Just a gentle suggestion that soon would be better than later. That night, after the house was quiet again, I packed a small overnight bag. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, a sweater in case the hospital was cold. Ordinary items for what I still thought of as an ordinary visit, just with slightly heavier circumstances. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., planning to be on the road by 7. Before going to bed, I almost called the hospital one more time just to hear an update. But I told myself it was late and he was probably sleeping. I didn't want to wake him or bother the staff unnecessarily. I would see him in person in the morning. That felt more meaningful than another brief phone call. I slept, but not deeply. My mind kept drifting to small memories. Daniel teaching me how to change a tire when we were teenagers. Daniel standing on that church lawn at my wedding. Daniel describing the lake at sunset. None of these thoughts were dramatic. They came and went quietly, like photographs being placed on a table and then lifted away again. The alarm rang at 6 a.m., and I got dressed quickly, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes when you have a clear task ahead. I drank coffee standing at the counter, barely tasting it. My wife handed me a thermos and told me to drive safely. I kissed her on the cheek and said I'd call when I arrived. The sky was still dim when I backed out of the driveway. The road was mostly empty, and for the first hour the drive felt almost peaceful. I remember thinking this will be good. We'll sit together, maybe laugh about how worried everyone got over a simple fall. I imagined him back at his house by the lake within a few days, walking carefully but still walking, still talking about the changing seasons. About halfway there, my phone rang again through the car speaker system. The number was the hospital. I answered immediately, my hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel. This time the voice was different. "Doctor," he spoke gently but directly. There had been another complication early that morning. Daniel's heart had gone into an irregular rhythm they were struggling to stabilize. They were doing everything they could. He paused, then added, "You should come as soon as you can." There was no panic in his words, but there was no room left for delay either. The quiet, reasonable plan I had constructed over the past few days suddenly felt fragile, as if it had been built on the assumption that time would stretch just a little longer to accommodate my schedule. I pressed the accelerator slightly, watching the miles on the highway markers count down slower than I wanted them to. For the first time, a clear thought settled in that I could not soften or postpone. I might not have as much time as I had been assuming all along. By the time I reached the hospital, the sun was already high, though I have no memory of the last stretch of highway. I only remember the feeling of moving forward without quite sensing the distance, as if the road itself had narrowed to a single point I was trying to reach. I parked too quickly, a little crooked between the lines, and sat there for a moment with the engine off, hands still on the steering wheel. It struck me then how ordinary everything looked. The parking lot, the people walking in and out, a man carrying a paper bag of breakfast from the cafeteria. Nothing in the scene announced that anything final might be happening inside. At the reception desk, I gave Daniel's name. The woman behind the counter nodded with quiet recognition and directed me to the cardiac floor. Her tone was kind but practiced, the way people speak when they have guided many others down the same hallway before. The elevator ride felt longer than it could have actually been. I watched the numbers light up one by one, thinking not about what I would say when I saw him, but about how strange it was that I had almost waited until the weekend. When I stepped onto the floor, a nurse met me halfway down the corridor. She asked if I was his brother. I said yes, and she placed a hand lightly on my arm in a way that told me more than her words would have. She explained that he was resting, that he had been in and out of consciousness, that the doctors were still monitoring his heart rhythm. "You can go in," she said softly. "He knows you're coming." The room was quiet except for the steady, mechanical sounds of monitors. Daniel looked smaller in the hospital bed than I remembered him. Not fragile exactly, just reduced in a way illness often reduces a person, stripped of the movement and expression that usually make them feel like themselves. His eyes were closed when I entered, and for a moment I simply stood there, unsure how to begin. It felt strange that after all the years of easy, casual conversations, I now had to decide on the first words carefully, as if they carried more weight than usual. I pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. After a few seconds, his eyes opened slowly. He looked at me, and there was recognition there, followed by a faint smile that seemed to take more effort than smiles used to. "You made it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I answered. Traffic wasn't bad. It was an ordinary response, the kind we might have used any other day. And for a moment it allowed us to pretend this was just another visit. I told him the leaves were turning along the highway, that the weather was cooler than it had been the week before. He nodded slightly, as if filing those details away. We did not speak about regret or lost time, not directly. That was not how we had ever talked to each other. Instead, we circled around smaller things. The house by the lake, whether the neighbor's dog was still barking at night, whether he had finished the book he mentioned during our last call. Each question and answer felt both ordinary and carefully chosen, as if we both understood there might not be many more chances for them. At one point he said, "I kept meaning to call you last month, just to talk." I felt something tighten quietly in my chest. I said, "I kept meaning to call you too." We both knew that was true. We also both knew that meaning to do something and doing it are not the same. But there was no blame in the room, no accusation. Just an acknowledgement, spoken in the simplest possible way. He closed his eyes for a while after that, and I sat there listening to the monitors, thinking about all the years when a phone call would have been easy. I thought about the times I had chosen to wait for a better moment, a less busy day, a weekend when I could talk without distraction. Those reasons had felt responsible at the time. They still sounded reasonable if I listed them one by one. Yet sitting there, I could see how they had quietly added up to a long pattern of delay. In the afternoon, the doctor came in and spoke with me in the hallway. He explained that Daniel's heart was weak, that the fall had revealed underlying issues that had likely been developing for some time. They would continue treatment, but he wanted me to understand that recovery was uncertain. He spoke gently without rushing, and I appreciated that. There was no dramatic moment, no single sentence that changed everything. Just a gradual understanding settling in, like dusk arriving so slowly you don't notice until the room has already grown dim. I stayed that night in a chair by the bed. Nurses came and went quietly, adjusting medications, checking monitors. Daniel drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes he would open his eyes and ask what time it was, or whether I had eaten dinner. Even then, he was still looking after small practical things, the way he always had in his own understated way. In the early hours of the morning, he was awake longer than before. The room was dim, lit mostly by the soft glow of machines. He looked at me for a while without speaking, and then he said, "We had a good run, didn't we?" It wasn't said sadly, more like a simple observation about the span of years we had shared. I nodded and said, "Yes, we did." That felt true. Despite the gaps, despite the delayed calls, we had carried a lifetime of shared history that no amount of distance could fully erase. A little later he added, "You don't have to stay every minute, you know. You've got your own life." It was exactly the kind of thing he would say, making space for me even now. I told him I was fine where I was, and I was. Sitting there felt like the most important place I could be, even if it had taken me longer than it should have to get there. He slept again after that. Sometime mid-morning, the rhythm on the monitor began to change. Slower, more irregular. The nurse called the doctor, and there was a quiet flurry of movement that never turned chaotic, just purposeful and subdued. I stood to the side, not in the way, watching people do what they were trained to do. After a while, the doctor looked at me and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. There was no dramatic final speech, no sudden revelation. His breathing simply grew shallower, then stopped, the way a long day ends without ceremony. I remember placing my hand on his, feeling the warmth still there for a few moments. I thought about how many times in life I had assumed there would be another call, another visit, another ordinary afternoon to make up for the last delay. Afterward, there were practical matters to handle. Forms to sign, belongings to collect, a conversation with a neighbor who had first called me. These tasks filled the first hours, giving my mind something steady to hold on to. When I finally drove to his house by the lake to gather a few things, I noticed the porch he had often described, the chair where he likely sat during quiet mornings. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the pale sky in a way that made everything look still and unchanged. I stayed there only a short time. The silence felt different now, not peaceful in the way he had described, but final. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I just let the road unfold in front of me, thinking about how easily we assume time will stretch to meet our intentions, how gently it can prove us wrong. In the years since, I have not been harsh with myself about those delayed calls. Regret, I've learned, is most honest when it sits beside gratitude rather than replacing it. I am grateful for the childhood we shared, for the easy conversations that always resumed without effort, for the quiet understanding that never fully disappeared between us. But I also carry a steady awareness now that presence cannot be postponed indefinitely, no matter how reasonable the delay feels in the moment. If this meant something to you, I'd like to hear your story. What's something you wish you hadn't delayed? And what decade of your life shaped you the most? I am 78 now, and when I think of my brother, I no longer tell myself there would have been more time. Instead, I remind myself that time is only ever what it is when it is offered. The rest is an assumption we make because it helps us move through busy days without feeling the full weight of how limited they really are.